It was just another regular day in the quiet, suburban neighborhood where Michael worked. His garage, tucked away on the corner of Elm Street, was nothing special, just a small, somewhat worn-down auto repair shop that had been his pride and joy for over a decade. The world around him moved quickly, but Michael's pace remained steady and unwavering. He wasn't one to chase the next big thing. He believed in hard work, dedication, and kindness. He believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was looking, and so when the woman drove into his shop that morning, looking frazzled and desperate, Michael didn't hesitate. She was a stranger to him. Her clothes were clearly worn, the kind of fabric that hadn't seen luxury in years. The old car she drove was a reflection of her struggles, a beat-up sedan with faded paint and a history of hardship. But there was something in her eyes, something that told him she didn't belong in that car or in that situation. There was an untold story behind her quiet plea for help. "Could you fix it?" she asked, voice trembling slightly. Michael gave her a warm smile, the kind of smile that made people feel like they mattered. "Don't worry about it, miss. I'll get it done for you. No charge." She looked at him, confused. But why? His answer was simple, heartfelt, because it's the right thing to do. As he got to work, the woman sat in the corner, watching with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. Her eyes followed his every move as if trying to figure out why someone would offer such an act of kindness, especially without expecting anything in return. She had been burned before, countless times. People often looked down on her, dismissed her as someone who didn't deserve help. It wasn't just her car that was broken, it was her spirit. But here, in this humble little shop, there was a spark of hope. And so, as Michael worked tirelessly through the hours, fixing her car as if it was his own, something changed within her. She watched the man, so simple, so kind, and for the first time in a long time, she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than struggle and disappointment. Maybe there were still good people in the world. Maybe she could dream again. Little did she know, this moment would be the catalyst for something far greater than either of them could ever imagine. But as the clock ticked on, and Michael finally put the finishing touches on the car, something else was happening. Something that would shake the very foundation of his quiet life. He didn't know it yet, but his act of kindness was about to change everything. And as the woman slowly rose to her feet, ready to thank him, a sound echoed down the street, a sound of engines, powerful and deep. She froze, looking out the window, and her heart skipped a beat. The sound grew louder, closer, and then, in a moment that would forever be etched in their memories, a fleet of luxury cars, polished and gleaming, pulled up in front of the garage. Expensive cars, Bentleys, Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, each one more stunning than the last. The sight was surreal, almost too extravagant to be real. The woman's jaw dropped. Michael stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag, utterly unaware of the scene unfolding before him. In the lead car, the door opened, and out stepped a man dressed in a suit that screamed power and wealth. He was a billionaire, someone whose name was whispered in the circles of the elite. But today, he wasn't here for his usual luxuries. He wasn't here for the extravagant displays of wealth. He was here for something else entirely. The woman's heart raced. Her past was filled with hardships, but this moment felt like fate. And as the man approached Michael, their eyes locked. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something profound was about to unfold. Michael, standing in the middle of his humble garage, had no idea that his kindness would lead him here. That the simple act of fixing a broken-down car would be the spark that ignited a chain of events no one could have predicted. The billionaire stepped forward, eyes still locked on Michael. And then the words came. Words that would forever change both of their lives. "Thank you for fixing her car. I believe that's the least I could do for you now." And with that, everything Michael knew about his life, his work, and his place in the world was about to be rewritten. When Jessica stepped into the small, dusty garage, she felt like a stranger in her own life. Her car had been sputtering for weeks, and now it was finally giving out completely. She had been driving it for years, ever since her mother passed away. It wasn't much. A faded blue sedan with dents from accidents, a cracked windshield that she couldn't afford to replace, and a cabin that smelled faintly of old cigarettes and faded dreams. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the steering wheel, her heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. She had tried everything to keep her life together, taking odd jobs, picking up shifts in the diner, scraping together enough money to pay the bills, but life seemed determined to throw obstacle after obstacle in her path. Jessica was no stranger to struggle. It had been her constant companion since childhood. Raised by a single mother, Jessica had known from a young age that life didn't hand out favors. It wasn't about fairness, it was about survival. She learned to live with the idea that things would never be easy, that she would always be a step behind, always fighting to make ends meet. But she never let it break her spirit. She held on to hope, fragile as it was, and tried her best to keep moving forward, even when the road seemed impossibly long. As she parked her car outside Michael's garage, she had no idea how much this moment would change her life. She had no idea that behind the grease stains and faded paint of his small repair shop was a man who held the key to her future, and to the hope she had almost lost. The garage was quiet, with only the soft hum of old machinery and the scent of oil in the air. It wasn't the glamorous kind of place she was used to seeing in movies or magazines, the shiny, pristine workshops where mechanics were always impeccably dressed and the cars were flawless. No, Michael's garage was raw, real, and full of the kind of hard work and dedication that never made it into the headlines. It was a place for people like her. People who couldn't afford to pay for expensive repairs or who didn't have the luxury of calling a mechanic who would fix their problems without asking for anything in return. Jessica stepped out of the car looking at the old building with a mix of hesitation and resignation. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in hours, but food was always an afterthought. There were bills to pay and dreams to chase, and sometimes survival meant skipping meals. As she walked toward the door, she caught sight of Michael working in the back. He was a man in his mid-30s, dressed in an old pair of jeans and a faded t-shirt with grease stains all over his hands. There was nothing flashy about him. He wasn't someone who could afford to look fancy or put on a show, but his presence was undeniable, steady, grounded, and kind. When Michael looked up and saw her standing there, his expression softened immediately. It wasn't pity. No, that wasn't it. It was empathy, a deep understanding of the silent struggles people like Jessica carried with them every single day. "Hey there," Michael said, his voice warm and inviting. "Looks like you're in need of a little help." Jessica forced a smile, but it felt thin, brittle. "Yeah," she said softly. "I don't really know what's wrong, but it's been making some weird noises. I think it's time to put it to rest." Michael nodded, gesturing for her to pull the car into the bay. As she did, she couldn't help but feel a wave of vulnerability wash over her. There was something about Michael's calm demeanor that made her want to open up, to tell him about the 1,000 little things that had built up over the years, the moments where she had wanted to give up but didn't, the times when her heart felt heavy with regret, when she had almost believed that maybe her struggles were a punishment for something she had done wrong. But she didn't say anything. Instead, she sat quietly in the waiting area, watching as Michael moved around her car, his hands moving with the ease of someone who had been doing this for years. He worked without asking questions, without making her feel like she was less than anyone else. There was something so simple, so unpretentious about Michael. He didn't see Jessica as a woman down on her luck. He saw her as someone who deserved to be treated with respect, no matter her circumstances. As he worked, Jessica's thoughts wandered. She thought of her mother, how hard she had worked to raise her, how she had sacrificed everything just to give Jessica a chance at a better life. She thought of the dreams she once had, the aspirations of becoming something more than just a waitress or a cashier. But somewhere along the way, she had lost those dreams. Life had a way of doing that to people. It crushed you down until you were so small so insignificant that the thought of reaching for anything higher seemed absurd. But maybe, just maybe, Michael's kindness was a sign. Maybe the universe was giving her a chance to dream again. Hours passed, and the silence between them grew comfortable. Michael didn't try to make conversation or ask prying questions. He simply worked, and she watched. Every now and then, he would glance at her, offering a smile that made her feel a little less invisible. It was in those small, fleeting moments that Jessica began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a strange warmth inside her chest, a spark of something better than the hopelessness she had lived with for so long. Maybe, just maybe, life didn't have to be this way. Maybe kindness, real, unconditional kindness, could heal wounds that no amount of money or success ever could. When Michael finished with her car, he didn't charge her a single dime. "It's on the house," he said, his voice genuine and unwavering. Jessica stood there, frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. There was no catch, no strings attached. This wasn't some act of charity. It was a simple act of kindness, pure and untainted by ulterior motives. She had expected the world to demand something from her in return, as it always did, but this time, there was no price to pay. Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes as she looked at him. She had spent so long fighting against the world, against her own doubts and insecurities, that she had forgotten what it felt like to trust. But in this small, humble garage, she realized that there were still people who believed in goodness. There were still people who didn't measure your worth by what you had or didn't have, and in that moment, something shifted. The weight she had carried for so long, the burden of her past, seemed just a little bit lighter. She wasn't just a struggling woman anymore. She was someone who had been seen, someone who mattered. Michael smiled gently, his eyes meeting hers. "You take care of yourself, all right?" he said, his voice soft but firm. "And if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to come by." And just like that, Jessica knew this moment wasn't just about a car. It was about a reminder that kindness could change everything. It was about the power of empathy and innocence, the kind of goodness that restored hope in places where it had long been forgotten. As Jessica drove away from the garage, her heart was still racing with the surreal feeling of having her car fixed for free. She had come to Michael's shop expecting nothing but another mundane stop on a day filled with the usual struggles, but instead, she had been given something that she hadn't realized she'd lost: hope. The drive back was slow, the engine purring, smoothly as though it had never even broken down. The usual creaks and groans were gone, and for the first time in a long time, Jessica felt something close to peace. But it was more than just the car that had changed. It was her understanding of the world, of people, and of herself. What Michael had done for her had shaken her to her core. Her mind raced back to the countless moments when she had held on to the belief that the world was cold, that people only gave when they expected something in return, that everything came at a price. She had lived with that belief for years, ever since her childhood. Growing up, she had watched her mother work tirelessly, giving up her own happiness to provide for Jessica. And even then, it wasn't enough. Jessica had never been one to accept charity. She had never wanted to feel like a burden on anyone, especially not on strangers. The idea of someone helping her without expecting anything in return had felt foreign. To her, almost too good to be true. She had always felt like there had to be a hidden agenda, a catch. Life had taught her that if someone was being kind, they wanted something, be it money, favors, or some form of indebtedness. And yet Michael had shown her a different way. As she sat at the stoplight, her thoughts began to unravel. She remembered the times when she had dismissed people's kindness, assuming that they only helped to get ahead or to show off their superiority. She had pushed people away, believing they didn't really care about her, because in her heart, she didn't think she was worthy of that care. But Michael had done nothing to make her feel small or inferior. He had simply seen her as another person in need, someone worthy of compassion without any expectation of return. The overwhelming truth of his actions hit her hard. She had been so wrapped up in her own suffering that she had forgotten the essence of humanity. The ability to be kind, to help, to give without asking anything back. Her mind flashed back to the moment in the garage when he had handed her the keys and said, "It's on the house." It hadn't been a flippant gesture. It hadn't been to prove a point or show superiority. It had been an act of pure, unconditional kindness. And in that moment, she realized just how much she had been wrong. For so long, Jessica had built walls around herself, walls made of self-preservation, fear, and pride. She had pushed others away, convinced that kindness was a weakness and that she needed to fight alone to survive. But Michael's generosity had shattered that perspective. His simple act of fixing her car without asking for anything in return had forced her to face the painful truth. Life wasn't about constantly fighting, constantly holding on to pride and independence. It was about connection, about recognizing the humanity in each other and understanding that sometimes being kind was the bravest thing you could do. As Jessica drove on, her heart heavy with realization, she couldn't help but wonder how many other people she had dismissed in her life. How many moments of kindness had she ignored because she was too proud to accept them? How many times had she turned away from the help of others because she believed she wasn't worthy, or that it was all a facade? The realization stung, but it also started to lift the burden that had been weighing on her for so long. She had spent years feeling like she was alone, isolated in her struggle, thinking that if she didn't make it on her own, she would somehow be less than others. But now, as she reflected on Michael's kindness, she understood that she didn't have to carry the world on her shoulders by herself. It was okay to accept help. It was okay to trust in the goodness of others. Her mind wandered to her own mother, who had worked herself to the bone for Jessica's sake. She had always thought that her mother's sacrifice was a form of martyrdom, something to be admired but not fully understood. But now, as she thought about Michael, Jessica began to see that her mother's sacrifices had come from a place of love and understanding, not pride or obligation. Her mother had given selflessly, just as Michael had. She hadn't been asking for anything in return. She had been giving from the heart, offering what she could, and trusting that her love was enough. In the quiet of her car, Jessica let the tears fall. She didn't try to stop them. For the first time in years, she let herself feel all the pain, all the regret, all the love she had buried under layers of hurt and pride. And in that raw, vulnerable moment, she felt a shift. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to carry the weight of the world on her own. She could let go of the bitterness that had clouded her judgment for so long. She could let others in, and maybe, just maybe, they would help her become the person she had always wanted to be. The road ahead seemed clearer now. The anger she had held for so long, anger at the world, at life, at herself, was starting to dissolve, replaced by something much more powerful: hope. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. Michael's kindness had sparked something inside her, a fire that would not be extinguished. It wasn't just about fixing her car anymore. It was about fixing herself. It was about realizing that redemption wasn't a distant dream, but something she could reach out and grab with both hands. Michael had unknowingly given her the first step toward her own transformation. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the road ahead, Jessica made a vow to herself. She would no longer walk through life with walls around her heart. She would no longer close herself off from the kindness of others. She would allow herself to trust again, to open up to the world, and let it surprise her with its goodness. And most importantly, she would honor the lesson Michael had taught. Her kindness wasn't a weakness. It was strength. And in a world that often felt cold and indifferent, it was the only thing that could heal the broken pieces of a heart. Jessica stood frozen in front of the garage, the air around her feeling thicker with every passing second. Her eyes stayed glued to Michael as he worked on her car, every gesture of his hands slow, deliberate, as though he was trying to make sure everything was just right. But what struck her the most wasn't the way he worked. It was his calmness, his determination, and most of all, his unwavering kindness. For the first time in ages, Jessica felt the lump in her throat tighten, a strange feeling she hadn't experienced in years. In the past, she had always kept a distance from people, kept her emotions hidden behind walls, behind her pride. Trusting anyone had seemed impossible. Life had taught her early on that she was on her own. Her father had disappeared when she was young, and her mother had toiled endlessly, working long hours just to keep food on the table. The concept of kindness, of people doing something for someone else without any personal gain, was something Jessica hadn't known. It felt foreign. But here, in the middle of an ordinary street, with an ordinary mechanic working on her car, something extraordinary was unfolding. Michael had been nothing but kind from the moment she stepped into his garage, and that simple act of offering help without asking for anything in return was beginning to change the way Jessica saw the world. As Michael wiped his hands on a rag and motioned her to come closer to the car, Jessica's heart skipped a beat. There was a certain energy in the air, something that was both heavy and light at the same time. Michael's calm demeanor seemed to bring a sense of peace to Jessica's chaotic thoughts. She had been so used to the idea that people only helped if they had something to gain, and here he was, offering her kindness as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "All right, I think it's all set," Michael said, looking up at her with a smile. His voice was warm, and there was no hint of condescension in it, just pure honesty. "Your car should be good to go now." Jessica didn't know what to say. The words were caught in her throat, and for a brief moment she couldn't even move. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. A stranger had just fixed her car for free. She hadn't been expecting it. She hadn't even asked for it. And yet, here it was, this overwhelming act of generosity that was breaking through the shell she'd built around herself over the years. She glanced at her car, then back at Michael, trying to process the overwhelming emotions rushing through her. The weight of her pride, her skepticism, and all the hurt she had carried for so long seemed to crumble under the force of what was happening. It was as if Michael's simple act had begun to unearth a long-buried truth within her. One, that she had never fully accepted. People could be kind. People could help without expecting anything in return. I don't know how to thank you," Jessica stammered, her voice shaking slightly. She felt her eyes welling up, and in that moment, she couldn't control it. She blinked rapidly, trying to push back the tears, but they came anyway, sliding down her cheeks. She wasn't sure if it was the physical relief of her car being fixed or the emotional weight of what had just happened, but the tears came flooding out, unbidden. Michael paused for a moment, his expression softening. He looked at her not with pity, but with understanding, like he could see the layers of struggle she had carried for so long. And in that quiet moment, with the hum of the garage around them, he spoke the words that would resonate with Jessica forever. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Sometimes all it takes is someone to remind us that we're not alone. That's all I'm doing. I'm just giving back what I've been lucky enough to receive from others." It was like a switch had been flipped inside Jessica. The walls she'd spent years constructing around her heart began to crack, and something warm, something fragile but powerful began to take root. Michael's words weren't just a form of comfort. They were a revelation. They weren't just about her car or the money she didn't have to spend. They were about the deeper need to connect with others, to let go of the bitterness and pride that had defined so much of her life. "Thank you," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. But it wasn't just the words she was saying, it was the meaning behind them. This was more than gratitude. This was her realizing that kindness didn't have to be something she gave up on. That there was more to life than just surviving. There was living, and there was sharing that life with others. Michael's smile grew, but it wasn't smug or self-satisfied. It was the smile of someone who understood the importance of human connection, of making a difference in someone else's life, no matter how small the act seemed. And in that smile, Jessica saw something she hadn't seen in years: hope. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. For the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was room for kindness in her life, room for people to care about her, and room for her to care about others. As Jessica got back into her car, the engine running smoothly, she felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. The tension in her body that had been there all day, all week, all year seemed to evaporate. Michael had not only fixed her car, he had fixed something in her heart, something she didn't even know was broken. With a deep breath, Jessica pulled away from the garage, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. She was no longer just a woman struggling to survive. She was someone who had seen the power of kindness, and now she would never be the same. The sun had already dipped, below the horizon, casting a soft golden hue over the streets of the small town. The quiet hum of the world going about its business filled the air as Michael closed the garage for the night. The day had been long, but it was moments like these, when everything was calm and quiet, that he found himself reflecting deeply on the choices he had made. The garage had been his father's dream before it became his own, a place where he could build a life, a legacy, even if it wasn't the grandest or most luxurious one. Still, it was enough. He was content, even if the sacrifices along the way had taken a toll. As he wiped down his tools, his thoughts drifted to Jessica. She had come to him in desperate need of help, a woman on the brink of giving up, with no money and no way to repair her car. She'd walked into his garage with a look of quiet defeat in her eyes, and for a moment, he'd seen a reflection of his own struggles. He had been there once too, needing help and not knowing where to turn, too proud to ask, too stubborn to accept it. And yet, it had been a kindness from a stranger that had saved him when he thought all was lost. For Michael, helping Jessica was never about receiving anything in return. He had been raised with the quiet, unspoken understanding that some things were simply meant to be given. His parents had worked tirelessly, and in their struggle, they had instilled in him a deep sense of duty to others. Even when they were barely scraping by, they had never turned anyone away. His father had always told him, "The world doesn't owe you anything, but you owe it to the world to help those who need it." But as the years passed and his own life became a balancing act between running the garage and keeping his head above water, Michael had come to realize that helping others came with its own set of sacrifices. Silent sacrifices. The kind that no one ever noticed, and no one ever thanked you for. They were the quiet moments when you gave up your time, your energy, your own comfort for someone else's benefit, without a second thought. The moments when you gave your all without ever asking for anything in return. As he sat down on the workbench, looking at the empty garage around him, Michael thought about his parents again. His father had passed a few years ago, leaving him with not just the garage, but the unspoken responsibility of carrying on their legacy. Michael had spent countless nights working long hours, fixing car after car just to make ends meet. The business had never been big, never flashy, but it had been his, and he had done everything he could to keep it running. Every sacrifice he made, every decision he had made in silence, was to ensure that the business would survive and hopefully grow. And yet, the sacrifices often left him exhausted, drained, and sometimes with nothing left for himself. The money he earned went straight back into the business. Tools, parts, rent. There was never much left over. He had never been able to afford luxuries, not for himself, and certainly not for anyone else. His life had always been a quiet struggle, a constant, balancing act of work and responsibility. But when Jessica had walked into his garage, he hadn't hesitated. Helping her was instinctual. He knew what it was like to struggle, to feel alone in the world. And in that moment, he had decided that she wouldn't have to go through it alone. Michael, didn't expect anything in return. He never did. But as the night wore on, he found himself thinking about what he had given up in the process. Helping Jessica had meant taking time away from his work, from the many repairs waiting for him. It had meant putting aside his own needs, his own exhaustion, to give her something he knew she needed, a chance to get back on the road, to keep moving forward. The next morning, as Michael arrived at the garage and began to open up, for the day, he found himself reflecting on the deeper truth of his actions. Helping others didn't always come with recognition or reward. Sometimes it didn't even come with a thank you. But in the end, it was the silent sacrifices that defined the people we were. It was the willingness to give without asking for anything in return, to help others even when it seemed like there was nothing left for ourselves, that truly mattered. And in his own quiet, unspoken way, Michael had found fulfillment in that. Jessica's gratitude, though unspoken, was something Michael could feel. It wasn't about the car, it was about the ripple effect of his actions, the way he had reached out to her, a stranger, and helped her without hesitation, without reservation. He didn't need to see her again or hear her say thank you. He already knew that the true reward of helping others lay not in the immediate acknowledgement, but in the long-term impact, the way kindness could change someone's day, their outlook, and sometimes their entire life. But Michael knew that sacrifices often came with unseen costs. They were the quiet moments that no one ever saw, the long hours spent fixing a car without even a second thought, the exhaustion that no one else would understand. Yet, it was in these moments of silent sacrifice that Michael realized he had built something greater than a business. He had built a legacy of kindness, integrity, and selflessness, and that to him was more valuable than anything else. As the day went on, Michael worked with his usual dedication, but there was a quiet peace inside him now. The sacrifices he made, the quiet, unnoticed efforts, had all led to this moment. He didn't need to be famous or wealthy. He didn't need to be acknowledged by the world. His life had meaning, not because of what he had gained, but because of the quiet sacrifices he had made to help others, to be there when it mattered. And when the fleet of luxury cars arrived in the days to come, when the world began to take notice of his garage and the impact he had made, Michael would know one thing for sure. The sacrifices he made, the quiet moments of giving, were what had led him here. He had never asked for recognition, but the world was about to recognize him for the man he had always been, the man who had quietly given everything for others. It had been a week since Michael had fixed Jessica's car, a week filled with uncertainty and anticipation, yet the clarity that came with it was undeniable. The feeling of knowing that despite all his struggles, he had done something meaningful, had helped someone who truly needed it, lingered in his heart. But that evening, as the sounds of the busy street outside echoed into his quiet garage, he couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. There was a growing weight on his chest, a premonition that told him his life was about to change, in ways he couldn't yet understand. As the night descended, a cold breeze whipped through the alley behind the garage. Michael stood at the workbench, staring at the engine of an old truck that had come in earlier that day. His hands were greasy, his clothes stained with the remnants of another long shift, but his mind was elsewhere, on Jessica. After her car had been fixed, he hadn't heard from her again, but he couldn't forget her face when she left, a face full of gratitude and a quiet sense of relief. He hadn't expected her to owe him anything, but he had hoped that the gesture might have made a difference in her life, just as she had unknowingly made one in his. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up to the garage caught his attention. It was late, far later than usual for a customer. Michael wiped his hands on a rag and looked out the window, his instincts kicking in. The car that had parked in front of his garage wasn't one he recognized. It was sleek, black, and polished to perfection, a stark contrast to the older vehicles he typically worked on. His eyes narrowed slightly as he watched a figure step out of the car. His heartbeat quickened, a gut feeling telling him that this wasn't just any customer. This was something different. The door swung open, and there stood Jessica, but not the Jessica he remembered. The woman who had walked into his garage a week ago, vulnerable and struggling, was now standing tall, dressed in a way that spoke of wealth and power. Her previously worn clothes had been replaced with a designer jacket and perfectly pressed pants. Her face, once etched with worry, was now framed with a quiet confidence. Michael stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to say or do. He had helped her, expecting nothing in return, but this was unexpected. The change in her presence, her posture, the way she held herself, it was almost like she was someone else entirely. But as she looked up and met his gaze, he saw the flicker of something familiar in her eyes, a glimmer of vulnerability that she was desperately trying to hide. Without a word, she walked toward the garage, and Michael immediately stepped forward, instinctively protective. He had always been a quiet man, content with his solitude, but there was something about Jessica, about the way she had entered his life with nothing but a hope for help, that made him want to shield her from whatever storm she was now walking into. The warmth in her eyes that had once been filled with gratitude was now clouded with something else, a hint of fear perhaps, or something darker. "Jessica," Michael finally said, his voice low but firm. "What's going on? You don't look like yourself." She stopped in her tracks, her eyes quickly scanning the garage before returning to him. There was a moment of hesitation before she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need your help, Michael. Again." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. She needed his help again, but this time, he could see that she wasn't just asking for something small or insignificant. The weight of the situation hung in the air between them, thick with the unspoken knowledge that whatever she was about to tell him would change everything. Without thinking, Michael stepped closer, his protective instincts surging. "What happened?" he asked, his voice steady but with an undertone of urgency. "What's going on?" She hesitated again, her eyes darting around the garage as if she were unsure whether to trust the space or him. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I never told you the full story, Michael. I wasn't just some woman struggling to fix her car. I was running from someone. A dangerous man who has been trying to ruin my life. He's connected to people who..." She broke off, her voice trembling slightly, as if the mere mention of this someone was enough to send a chill down her spine. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he listened, a flood of emotions crashing over him. The vulnerability in her voice, the fear in her eyes. He could sense that this wasn't just a simple car repair anymore. This was a matter of life and death, and Jessica was asking for his help. Again, not just because of a broken-down car, but because she was in danger. And no matter what happened, Michael knew one thing. He wasn't about to let her face this alone. He stepped forward, his eyes locked with hers, a determination burning in his chest. "You don't have to worry about him anymore. I'll make sure of it," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He had never been one to boast or promise things he couldn't deliver, but this was different. This wasn't just about fixing a car or helping out a stranger. This was about protecting someone who had trusted him, someone who was now at the mercy of a threat too powerful for her to face alone. Jessica's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. She had come to him expecting help, but Michael's protective tone, the sheer determination in his voice left no doubt that he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let her be dragged into whatever danger lurked in her past. He had no idea who or what she was up against, but that didn't matter. All that mattered was that she wasn't alone anymore. "Michael, you don't understand," she began, but he cut her off, his voice unwavering. "I don't care what's going on," he said, his gaze hardening with resolve. "I won't let anything happen to you. No one's going to hurt you, not while I'm here." In that moment, Michael made a vow that he would protect her with everything he had. He didn't know how he would defeat the shadows of her past, but he would find a way. His determination was like a shield, something unyielding and steadfast. He wasn't just going to stand by. He was going to act. Whatever it took, he would keep her safe. And as Jessica looked at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and hesitation, she realized that this was no longer just a matter of a broken-down car. It was a turning point, a moment where everything could change. The person who had once been a stranger was now the one person who would stand between her and the darkness threatening to consume her. Michael's protective instincts had kicked in, and now nothing would stop him from seeing it through. "I'll help you," he said again, more firmly this time. "I won't let anyone hurt you. You're safe here. I promise." The days that followed were heavy with an undeniable tension. Michael's protective instincts had not only kicked in, but had become the driving force in his every action. He spent long nights at the garage, working tirelessly to ensure that Jessica would never have to face the past she had been running from alone. But as much as he immersed himself in helping her, a gnawing feeling of regret began to claw at his insides, a regret that he couldn't shake off. Michael had always lived a life of simplicity, working with his hands, fixing things that were broken, whether they were cars, engines, or people. But this time, things were different. This wasn't just about fixing something physical. The weight of Jessica's past, the fear she carried, and the burden of her silence had started to seep into his soul. He felt it in his bones that something far bigger than a broken vehicle was at play. He had been pulled into a world that was as dangerous as it was mysterious, and yet he couldn't walk away. For the first time in his life, Michael began to question the choices he had made. His life had always been filled with hard work and practicality, never deviating from what he knew. Yet this situation with Jessica, this desire to protect her at all costs, was a stark reminder that he had never really lived beyond his own narrow view of the world. He had been content, yes, but it was a contentment built on the idea that nothing outside his simple life mattered. He had never truly allowed himself to open his heart to the complexities of the world around him. Until now, one night, as he sat alone in his small apartment, surrounded by the hum of city lights outside and the lingering smell of car oil from the garage, the weight of his regret became too much to ignore. He thought back to the moment when Jessica had walked into his garage with nothing but a broken car and a quiet plea for help. Back then, he had simply been motivated by a sense of compassion, something instinctual. But as the days passed, he realized that his feelings for her went beyond the kindness of helping a stranger. The regret he felt wasn't just about his involvement in her dangerous situation. It was deeper. He regretted not having been more open to people in his life before, regretted the walls he had built around his heart, convinced that he didn't need anyone to depend on. He regretted how he had closed himself off from the possibility of something more meaningful, more emotional. And now, as the stakes grew higher, he felt as though he were being pulled into a story of redemption that he hadn't anticipated. Michael had always been someone who solved problems, fixed things, and moved on. But this time, the emotional weight of the situation was not something that could be easily fixed with a wrench or a tool. It was something deeper. It was something about trusting others, allowing vulnerability to lead, and confronting the parts of himself that he had spent years avoiding. And so, in the silence of his room, Michael made a decision. He couldn't continue this journey with Jessica while battling his inner turmoil. If he was truly going to protect her, if he was going to be the person she needed him to be, then he had to face the regret that had been growing inside him. He had to confront his past mistakes and take responsibility for the choices he had made. The next day, Michael found himself standing at the doorstep of the garage, ready to face not only Jessica's dangerous past, but his own. He had been holding on to a fear that he wasn't good enough, that he didn't deserve to be the protector, the hero she needed. But that fear was rooted in his own insecurities he could no longer afford to indulge. Jessica was sitting inside the garage, her back to him as she stared out the window. Her posture had changed since the first time he had met her. She wasn't just the woman who needed a car fixed anymore, She was someone he had come to care for deeply, someone whose life now intertwined with his in ways he had never anticipated. "Jessica," Michael said, his voice low but steady. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for answers. "Michael, she began. But he cut her off with a small shake of his head. He knew what she was about to say. She had been apologizing for days, trying to make him understand that she never intended to drag him into her mess, her dangers. But that wasn't the problem. He wasn't upset with her. He wasn't angry. He was angry with himself for thinking he could fix everything without opening his heart. "I've been thinking a lot," Michael said, walking slowly towards her. "About everything. About how I've been living. About how I've been running from my own mistakes." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been so focused on fixing things, on protecting people, that I never took the time to see what was really important. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the things I've ignored in my own life." Jessica's eyes softened as she listened to him, the concern in her gaze deepening. She took a step forward but said nothing, letting him continue. "I've been living in this little bubble, Jessica, thinking that if I just kept to myself, I'd be okay. But I wasn't okay. Not really. And you made me realize that." He took a deep breath. "I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes. But I want to make things right. I want to make this right, not just for you, but for me too." Jessica's face was a mirror of emotions, and Michael could see the flicker of understanding in her eyes. She had come to him looking for help, for someone to save her, but she hadn't realized that in helping her, he had been saving himself, too. "I've spent so much time being scared of getting involved, of being vulnerable," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But I've realized that it's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay to let people in, and I'm going to do that now. I'm going to be the man I need to be, not just for you, but for myself." The room was still, the weight of his words sinking in. Jessica's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she stepped toward him. For a moment, everything stopped. Time, the world, the threats that loomed outside. And in that pause, Michael knew that he wasn't just looking at a woman who needed help anymore. He was looking at someone who had become a part of his journey, a part of his redemption. "Thank you, Michael," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't know how much this means to me." The atmosphere in the garage was tense, charged with a sense of impending danger, yet there was something else building up, something far more powerful than the anxiety hanging in the air. The tension wasn't just from the looming threats surrounding Jessica. It came from the realization that they were both on the edge of something monumental. The moment of truth was closing in. Michael could feel it deep in his gut. There was no turning back now. For weeks, he had been tirelessly fixing cars, working through the night to keep Jessica safe, all the while trying to fend off the looming shadow of the people after her. But despite his best efforts, there was an undeniable unease. What if, despite everything, they couldn't outrun the danger? What if, despite all the work he'd put in, the people who had been chasing Jessica would find them, corner them, and ruin everything they had fought for? As Michael worked late into the night, grinding away at a new luxury car that had mysteriously appeared at the garage, a gift that didn't quite feel like a gift anymore, his mind couldn't shake the thought of what was to come. He knew something was coming. His instincts screamed at him, telling him to prepare. But no amount of preparation could truly prepare him for what was about to unfold. Jessica had always been strong, but she had her moments of vulnerability, and Michael had seen those moments. It was in her eyes, the occasional hesitation, the fear masked by her tough exterior. She was running, not just from the people who had hurt her, but from the reality of her life. And for Michael, it wasn't just about fixing her car or providing her with a safe place to stay anymore. It was about standing beside her, about protecting her in ways she hadn't asked for and ways she hadn't known she needed. As the hours passed, an eerie quiet settled over the garage. Michael's wrench clicked against the undercarriage of the car, the sound echoing in the stillness. Then suddenly, the garage door creaked open. Michael froze, his heartbeat quickening, instinctively slipping into protective mode. The air around him felt thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. In the distance, headlights gleamed through the fog that had begun to settle outside. At first, Michael thought it was just another late-night customer or maybe a delivery, but as the sound of a powerful engine roared closer, he felt a shift in the air. Something about the way the car approached was different, too deliberate, too calculated. Michael's instincts flared. He walked towards the window, peering out through the blinds, and what he saw made his heart skip a beat. A fleet of high-end luxury cars, too many to count, pulled up to the entrance of his garage. Each one more expensive and sleek than the last. Each one a symbol of wealth and power that far exceeded anything Michael had ever dealt with in his simple blue-collar world. His pulse quickened, and the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Before he could react, the door to the garage slammed open, and a man dressed in a sharp suit, someone Michael had never seen before, stepped in. His presence was commanding, almost overwhelming. Michael's hand instinctively reached for the wrench, his mind racing to figure out what this was all about. Who were these people? What did they want with Jessica? "Are you Michael?" the man asked, his voice smooth, professional. "I'm Michael. Who are you?" Michael's voice was steady, though every nerve in his body was screaming for him to be ready for anything. The man smiled slightly, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that hinted at secrets, at power, at something far more dangerous than Michael had ever expected. "I represent a group of individuals who have an interest in your work, particularly in the work you've been doing for Ms. Jessica." The name hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He turned to Jessica, who had stepped out of the back office, looking equally confused and unsettled by the unexpected guests. "You've been protecting her, fixing cars, offering your services for free," the man continued, his eyes scanning the garage with a calculated interest. "We've been watching, and now we want to make sure that your generosity is properly rewarded." At that moment, a figure stepped out of one of the sleek cars, tall and imposing, and Michael felt the weight of his presence immediately. The figure walked towards Michael and extended a hand. His handshake was firm, strong, too strong, as though he had expected Michael to be intimidated. But Michael stood his ground, unwavering. "I'm Ethan Blackwood," the man said with an air of authority. "I represent a consortium of investors with an interest in high-end auto repair, performance modifications, and unique car collections. You've shown an aptitude for your craft, Mr. Michael. We think you'd be an asset to our team." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Michael was speechless. His mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. This wasn't just about fixing cars anymore. It was something much larger, something far beyond his wildest dreams. Ethan's eyes held an unsettling glint as he continued. "We're willing to offer you a partnership, a chance to expand, to bring your garage into the fold of an empire." The proposal was shocking, almost overwhelming. Michael had spent his life working hard to make ends meet, to earn just enough to get by. But now, here in front of him, was an opportunity that seemed too big to believe. Could he really do this? Could he really walk away from everything he knew and take a chance on something this huge? But as he glanced at Jessica, he knew that this moment wasn't just about business. It wasn't just about the cars or the money. This was about the chance to change everything, not just for himself, but for her as well. He had already come, so far protected her from danger, but now the stakes were even higher. "Jessica," Michael said, turning to her, his voice filled with determination. "This is it. This is our chance. But no matter what happens next, I'll never stop fighting for you. I'll always have your back." The inspiration behind his words surged through him. It wasn't about the luxury cars, the money, or the empire. It was about something far more meaningful. It was about the way Jessica had changed his life, the way she had made him realize that life wasn't just about surviving. It was about living, taking chances, and fighting for something greater than yourself. Ethan's offer was tempting, but it wasn't just about the money or the power. Michael had come to realize that his true wealth lay in the relationships he built, in the way he had stepped up to protect someone who needed him. That, to him, was worth far more than any high-end car or billionaire partnership. It was a reminder that his path forward wasn't defined by what others wanted from him. It was defined by his willingness to take risks, to trust, and to fight for what mattered. As the tension in the room grew, Michael knew one thing for sure. He was about to step into a new chapter, one where everything was on the line. But no matter what happened next, he wasn't going to face it alone. He had come too far, and with Jessica by his side, there was nothing he couldn't overcome. The moment was still, hanging in the air like the final note of a song that lingered long after the music stopped. Michael stood there in the garage, surrounded by the gleaming luxury cars that now marked a monumental shift in his life. It wasn't just the vehicles that stood as symbols of change. It was everything that had led him to this point. The late nights, the struggles, the quiet sacrifices, the love and loyalty to someone who had unknowingly become his anchor. Jessica stood beside him, her presence a steady force against the chaos of the world around them. Her eyes, usually filled with a hint of fear and hesitation, now gleamed with something else. A flicker of hope, a glimmer of possibility. She had been his reason for everything. From the moment she walked into his life, vulnerable, lost, and desperate for a way out, she had unknowingly sparked a fire within him, and in return, he had shown her what it meant to trust again, to believe that no matter how deep the pit of despair, there was always a way to rise. The proposal from Ethan Blackwood, the billionaire investor, hung heavy in the air. The offer was too big to ignore. The money, the opportunity, the chance to be part of something far greater than the small garage he had once worked in, everything that had once seemed out of reach now lay at his feet. Yet, despite the allure of wealth and fame, Michael knew something that no amount of money could replace: the depth of his commitment to Jessica, the unwavering loyalty that had guided him through every step of this journey. As the tension hung between them, the silence was broken by Ethan, his voice filled with patience but also a note of finality. "You don't have to make a decision right now, Michael. The offer stands. But you must understand, this kind of opportunity doesn't come every day. It's a chance to change your life, to build something that will outlast you. You could be at the top of this empire." Michael stood there, eyes locked on the man who represented everything he had never dared to dream of. Ethan's words were enticing. They were tempting. But deep down, Michael knew that he wasn't looking for fame or wealth or the chance to become part of an empire. What mattered most to him was the life he could build with Jessica, a life free from the chains of the past, from the fear and uncertainty that had once defined them both. Turning to Jessica, Michael felt a weight lift off his chest. It wasn't the weight of the decision in front of him. It was the realization that he had already made it. He had already chosen his path, not the one that led to fortune and fame, but the one that led to the heart of who he was, to the love he had found, to the promise of something real, something lasting. He reached out and took Jessica's hand, his voice steady, full of conviction. "We don't need an empire, Jessica. We've already built something far more valuable than that. We've built trust. We've built a life. And that's worth more than anything money could buy." Jessica's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and for the first time in a long while, Michael saw her fully, vulnerable yet strong, terrified yet hopeful. In that moment, she wasn't the girl running from her past. She was the woman standing beside him, ready to face the future together. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise that they would face whatever came next, side by side. Ethan, seeing the bond between them, his gaze softened for the briefest moment. There was a quiet understanding between the three of them now. It wasn't about the money or the cars or the empire. It was about people, about connections that transcended the material world, about the moments that defined who they were, not by their wealth, but by their integrity, their loyalty, and their courage. "You've made your decision," Ethan said, his voice now tinged with respect. "I won't push further. But know this, you have the potential to be far more than you've ever imagined. The world is full of opportunities, Michael. Don't forget that." Michael nodded, a quiet smile forming on his lips. "I won't. But this is the life I choose." The tension in the room melted away. Ethan turned to leave, his footsteps echoing as he walked back to his fleet of luxury cars. But as he reached the door, he paused and looked back at Michael and Jessica one last time. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and there was a quiet acknowledgement of paths taken, of lessons learned, and of futures yet to unfold. As the door closed behind him, the garage felt different. It was no longer just a place for fixing cars. It was a symbol of everything they had overcome, of everything they had built. It was their sanctuary, their home. In the days that followed, the garage became something greater. Not because of the wealth or the cars, but because it was a place where dreams were given space to breathe, where people didn't just come to get their cars fixed, they came to find something more. It was a place of hope, of redemption, and of second chances. Michael and Jessica didn't need the billionaire empire. They didn't need the fame or the fortune. What they had was more than enough. They had each other. They had the strength of their bond, the depth of their commitment, and the clarity that came from knowing they had made the right choice. Together, they had found something more valuable than gold. A life built on love, trust, and unwavering loyalty. And as the days passed and the garage continued to thrive with the steady hum of activity, they both knew that this was only the beginning. The future was wide open, full of endless possibilities. But no matter what came next, they would face it together, knowing that their love was the one thing that would always guide them home. The story of Michael and Jessica wasn't just about a mechanic helping a struggling woman. It was about the power of human connection, the strength that comes from love, and the courage to stand up for what truly matters. It was a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones you can't buy. They're the ones that come from the heart, and in the end, that was all they needed.